Welcome back to this channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about things that I have learned from living with chronic migraine disease. Number one is the importance of navigating and addressing patterns of self-blame. With chronic migraine disease, especially the specific variations that I navigate on a daily basis, it can be very easy to hit all of the right markers, to make sure you're hydrated, to eat the right things, to move in the right way, to manage screen time, to manage, our spoons, and still have the ramifications of chronic migraine disease. For me, it's been like one long bout of migraine for 10 years that has not subsided and I have not experienced relief from. So the temptation for me early on became to, okay, well, what did I do wrong? Or what did I do to deserve this? Being able to acknowledge that those were patterns of self-blame, it kind of helped me begin the process of learning to live in spite of having these invisible disabilities. Second thing that I've learned from living with chronic migraine disease is that no one in our lives can pretty much have, what we would deem as perfect understanding. So letting go of the frustration of trying to explain things perfectly to physicians or family members or friends or whoever it might be, and just learning to communicate authentically about what we're experiencing has been freeing for me. For a long time, I would get frustrated with the symptoms that would cause me to struggle with my speech, i.e. speech aphasia, brain lethargy that is prevalent 24/7, as well as chronic fatigue syndrome. All of those things interact when I'm speaking or communicating or trying to stay on track in terms of creativity and the thought process I pursue. And so being able to just come to terms with that I'm not perfect. My explanation might not be the best, but what it can be is real and authentic. Also, not to worry about controlling how much of that information or that aspect of myself I share with someone that gets interpreted in a positive or an effective manner. I can't control that. So learning, when is enough and continuing to communicate regardless of the outcome, because ultimately self-advocacy isn't something that is done because it's comfortable. It's done because it's necessary. Number three, as a Black woman with chronic migraine disease and the variations I live with, it's very interesting because there's not a lot of research on the impact of migraine disease on our community. So number three is the lesson of not only being intentional in my research, but resting in the fact that even if I don't meet other people who have my same ethnicity experiencing the same thing, I can meet other chronic illness warriors who are of my same ethnicity, and we may have some commonalities just by the basis of having chronic illnesses and at times multiple chronic illnesses, and then moving from there in regards to intersectionality and all the ways that, being Black and having chronic illness impacts our lives. Number four, it's strategically about spoons. I think the moment I began to fully grasp what it means to delegate my energy. A lot of times we hear on social media like, oh, it's all about your vibe, your energy. Well, in chronic illness, it's a different type of thing. Like when we say energy, if you look at the physiological or the biological term energy, it is the ability to do work. And whatever work is, it could be creating, it could be in a occupational setting, whatever it is, it could be activities of daily living. For chronic illness warriors, energy is the ability to do anything because everything and anything requires work to complete those tasks, and it requires sacrifice. The lesson is learning to come to terms with that and then adjust accordingly and be patient with myself. Like if I don't have the spoons to do laundry today on, a consistent basis, then doing it when I can. I had a professor in college, and he would always tell me, because he knew I struggled with perfectionistic tendencies, and he would always tell me, Mayia, done is better than perfect. And I think with chronic illness, a similar concept can be true. Like when you can get to it, you'll get to it. In the meantime, rest, recover, and do what is best for your body so that you can be present for whatever else you have supposed to be present for. Number 5, community is so important, not just in the context of maybe a church community or a friend community or a community surrounding a particular area of interest, but community involving chronic illness, especially chronic migraine disease. Chronic migraine disease and the concept, the very definition of it, lends ourselves to feeling isolated at times. You know, more than 1 billion people on the planet have some sort of disability or illness. 1 in 9 adults struggle with chronic migraine disease, and most of them are women. So navigating this world by yourself with an incurable condition is difficult at times because it makes you feel like you're on an island, even though those statistics show that we are not alone in the experience of living with an illness or disability, but it can feel that way. And so community is very crucial in that we get to, let down our guard, so to speak, and just talk about the real, authentic aspects of living with chronic migraine disease. One of the communities that was very helpful for me in my growth was the Move Against Migraine Facebook group that was created by the American Migraine Foundation. Through there, I was able to talk about some of my gripes and struggles, maybe with ableism in a church setting or struggles with accommodations and communication in a college setting. But being able to have people surround me and simply chime in and say, you know what, I get it, and genuinely know that they get it. It just adds a level of comfort and a level of assistance in that, okay, I know I'm not alone and I know there's people who get it, so I can kind of have courage to kind of face those things. Number 6, one of the main things that I have learned from living with chronic migraine disease almost 10 years is that what works for someone else treatment wise might not work for me. What works for me might not work for someone else treatment wise. And the key for me has been not beating myself up when treatment that, is popularized and works for everybody, like Botox or CGRP injections or triptans, work for one group of people and it doesn't even phase my symptoms in the least bit. Like having grace to know that, because chronic illness is so diverse, like 2 people with the same condition, same set of symptoms can experience those symptoms and those conditions in vastly different ways. But having the courage to remind myself, like, okay, that didn't work for me. I have a different set of biology. My physiology is different. My anatomical structure is different. Everything about me is different from the next person experiencing chronic migraine disease. So having grace in that capacity and not comparing myself or beating myself up when people who don't experience chronic migraine disease continuously are very adamant about reminding me about treatments that they see on TV or sit in their inboxes or on Facebook, and they send them to me. Yes, that's annoying, and I very much recommend that you don't do that. Don't send that to somebody with chronic migraine disease, because it just reminds them, or it makes them feel like, oh, well, this is what I haven't done. And in actuality, they're probably doing a lot more than you realize. They're just expressing that between themselves and their healthcare physician who is actually qualified. So I say all that to say the importance of just recognizing that it's a journey of figuring out what works best for you. Some people never find a medicinal treatment or a prescriptive treatment that works, but maybe they found an alternative method. Some people never find any of that. Some people find, CGRPs helpful. Some people find Beverly helpful. Whatever it is, learning what works best for you and not penalizing yourself when your body doesn't respond in the same way that medication or treatment responded for someone else. Number 7, this one is probably one of my favorite lessons that I've learned, is the value of being honest with ourselves, the value of acknowledging the impact that the illness itself is having on you. In the early stages of my diagnosis, I was in so much denial. It was ridiculous. And I made choices to self-medicate and address that were not even conducive to who I was as a person. And pain has a very heavy impact, so much so that it can be a motivator or a demotivator. It can be a motivator in a positive or a negative sense. It can be a demotivator in a positive or a negative sense. And so learning to acknowledge it. Like if you're having an off day in your mental health, recognize that that could be your chronic illness impacting your mental health, from the, things like fatigue, from the medical system, from the diagnosis process. Acknowledge that, and whether it's therapy or self care, like doing the work of unpacking that. Because what happens is, if we stay in a state of denial, we don't get the treatment that we need to manage those symptoms or to live well in spite of those symptoms. And, ultimately, that's what my podcast, Better Not Bitter, was born out of. Simply the concept of not allowing our chronic illnesses, our invisible disabilities, even albinism to impact us in such a way that we don't address the things that are either to our detriment or to our benefit, and we become bitter. And the last thing we want to do is become bitter, because it creates this cyclical effect that impacts our body on a physiological level. And so if you're interested in the Better Not Bitter podcast, you can click the link in the description, follow this tab here, and you can also click the link in the description to get some Better Not Bitter merch, just as a reminder of taking it one day at a time, acknowledging the little things, tackling the big things, and continuing to do your best to be present in spite of the symptoms, in spite of life's challenges, and in spite of disability. Number 8. This kind of piggybacks off of the other one, and it's the idea of self-care. And the reason why I say the idea of self-care, because, self-care has become super popularized in social media, but for people with chronic illnesses, self-care doesn't always look the same. As a matter of fact, it probably takes more intentionality than what pop culture deems it as. For us, it might not be treating ourselves to a restaurant. Self-care can be spending time in bed drawing, or if we're not able to pick up a pencil, typing a journal entry in the notes section of our phone or device. Self-care can be binge watching The Office, which I've been doing for a couple of weeks. Self-care can be talking to a loved one you haven't spoken to in a while and being able to have that person be a sounding board. It looks different. And for me, just embarking on the journey of self-care has been beneficial, and it's been challenging. As someone who is a deeply motivated person, not being able to do or act on the things that my mind is saying, like, oh, I have this goal, I want to do this today or this today. Like, I used to have full-on to-do lists. I don't make to-do lists anymore. I just make lists so that I don't forget things. So, like appointments or whatever the case might be. And I think self-care is more so about simplifying our experience with chronic illness so that it accommodates our symptoms, but it also accommodates who we are as a person in response to chronic illness, because it does change us. It does change the way we think. It does change the way we see the world, and hopefully for the better. Number 9 is that I have learned that I am my own best advocate. Aside from Jesus Christ, I am my own best advocate. And what I mean by that is that no physician knows my body like I know my body. I have a bachelor's degree in kinesiology, which is the study of the human body and all of the physiological ramifications that interplay when we exercise or move in general. Like, movement was my major. And to have multiple chronic illnesses that impact my ability to move from a physical activity standpoint has been humbling. I was the person, I used to power lift. I played basketball, very athletic. But when chronic illness sits you down in that capacity, not only is it humbling, sometimes it can elicit these thoughts, so to speak, of shame. So not only did I get to a point of downplaying what I knew from a educational standpoint, but I downplayed what I knew because I wasn't the Mayia that could do all those things I used to do. So I would show up in doctor's appointments, expecting them not to believe me. if I'm being honest. I expected them not to believe me because so many physicians before looked at me and told me nothing was wrong when clearly there was, because I wasn't the Mayia I used to be. So learning over time that I have value in those conversations with my physicians. Like, I know what's normal, what's not, when the cracking of my joints becomes more than just the normal cracking of my joints, what hip instability feels like, what subluxations begin to feel like, what atypical bout of migraine feels like for me, in addition to what I already experienced. I know those things. And so being able to now keep records of those things from a note-taking standpoint, but also from a mental standpoint, like, I know this. Like, I don't have to go into these meetings assuming that they're not going to believe me. I get to pick and choose who gets to be a part of my team now. And as someone who, like I said, was an athlete, I've always been big on team. The team aspect, like, everybody is involved in the roles that they play. Everybody is serving one another. Everybody is collaborating to meet one goal. Nobody is the superstar, and nobody is ultimately trying to be better than another person. We're all working together to achieve that one goal. And I had that same mentality towards accommodations as well. And so being able to have that mentality now that I've gotten past most of the medical trauma, now that I've gotten past most of the initial, trauma or frustration that comes with chronic illness, now I'm on the other side of it, where I'm navigating it with the thought process of how can I manage this? Because I know what I'm called to do. I know what I can do given my spoons. I know what I shouldn't be doing, even though I want to be doing certain things like running. Like, I shouldn't be doing that, but it is tempting sometimes. But now that I know that, I can come in with more confidence and less suspicion. And I say less suspicion because it is still there, especially when you're dealing with new physicians, but with a lot less suspicion. And lastly, number 10, one of the biggest lessons from living with chronic migraine disease is kind of like a part A and part B. One, it's living with chronic illness, chronic migraine disease, and allowing my faith to impact my illness, as well as allowing the parts of my chronic illness that impact me the most to show through my creativity. And those things kind of go in hand in hand for me, because my faith in Christ allows me to have faith that in spite of what I live with, I can live and be present. It means I'm going to have to adapt differently and maneuver this world differently, but it doesn't diminish the purpose that I was given. And I think so many times we internalize ableism to a fault, that we perceive that because we can't do things or serve in our communities the way that most people without disabilities would serve, that we can't serve at all. But I think that more and more we're beginning to see people with disabilities create their own lane, the areas where we can be the puzzle pieces that have been missing for society on issues in areas of advocacy and creativity. And so allowing the faith that influences everything else to influence chronic illness and vice versa, because chronic illness has taught me about myself in light of how I see God, in light of how I see my neighbor, in light of how I love people and respond to people who are ignorant, who don't care about my symptoms, because reality, everybody does not care. And even creativity, allowing my creativity to impact my illness. So knowing that I am a creative person, making the sacrifices to say, you know what, if I want to paint today, let me move some things around and let me be intentional about doing something that brings me joy, something that I might not even post, but I'm doing it because it brings me joy and I'm operating in my gifting.